Hey yo, I'm Miss Linnea Lark and I'm a high school art teacher, and today I'll be teaching you how to relief carve with clay. Carving is a very exciting sculptural technique that can be used on any firm surface with the right tools. Carving is a subtractive process. This basically means that you start with a material and then cut or carve away parts to make a 3D image. Nothing is added, things are only carved or subtracted. Check out some of these examples. Notice the different types of surfaces as well as the array of functions these sculptures serve. They're made of wood, graphite, fruit, and stone. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how I create a relief carving on a piece of pottery. Relief carving is a carving technique where a 3D image is carved into a flat surface. Historically, relief carvings were often used in public areas to tell a story. And this tutorial is for my pottery 3 kids who have been asked to create a myth carved pot so that they can work on their visual storytelling skills. The first thing we gotta do is brainstorm ideas. But in this case, I had to do a fair amount of research and Googling to find a story, fairy tale, or myth that excited me. I landed on the story of the white tiger from Chinese mythology. This myth appealed to me because in the story, a 500-year-old tiger's tail only turns white when the emperor rules with virtue. Once I've brainstormed and researched the myth's history and meaning, I think of imagery I could use to tell the story. Remember that when you're brainstorming, you want to jot down all your ideas, both the strong and the weak ideas. You never know how they're going to mix up later. Then, once you're finished, circle the words, images, ideas, and colors that you are drawn to. Up next is references. Now that I'm familiar with the myth of the white tiger and I've read the story on multiple sites, it's time to research images that I can reference for drawing proportions and styles. It's also important that I research Chinese imagery and colors that will help me honor this mythological story. I usually make my students get anywhere from 5 to 10 images, but I highly suggest that you get way more. The more images I use as reference, the less likely I will be to copy just one. I like to find multiple images and ideas and then combine them in my own unique way. It was also important to me to get ancient and contemporary Chinese imagery, as well as photographs that would help me depict the white tiger myth. And now we're on to thumbnails. Thumbnails are all about the composition and arrangement of the images or items in your scene. It's important that your composition be well balanced and harmonious. Your images should be laid out in such a way that your story is well represented but also mysterious and intriguing. Good luck. I know that sounds like a tall order, but the more practice, the better we'll get. I only did 2 thumbnails, but I make my students do a minimum of 3 thumbnails. Thumbnails should be quick and rough. Just draw enough that you understand the basic composition and layout of the items in your image. Don't worry about accurate drawing at this stage. Draft. So a draft is like a perfect blueprint. Not perfect in that you did everything perfectly, but perfect in the sense that everything's exactly where you want it. Because we'll be using this draft to transfer our image onto our pot. Your draft should be the exact same size or shape of your work surface or pot. Since my pot has varied areas with different circumferences, I measure multiple areas of my pot in order to get the most accurate draft shape. A draft takes your chosen thumbnail to the next level. Your draft is the time to get the exact measurements and to draw everything with perfect precision. Your draft will help you work out the kinks of your design in a low-risk way. And it helps you save time by pre-designing and pre-planning your final image right down to every exact detail, lines and shapes. This is also the time to make sure your drawing style is cohesive and harmonious. I like to make my draft the exact size of my final pot. This way I can trace parts directly onto my pot, saving more time. It is also much easier to erase and fix mistakes with flat paper and pencils than it is to make mistakes and fix them onto a three-dimensional surface like a pot. There's one really important rule for your draft. Your image should be made of shape and not line. I mean, the shapes are made of line, but you should never have just a simple line somewhere defining a space. A line is flat and a shape is 3D. Since we're going to be creating a 3D carved sculpture, we need to make all of our lines into shapes. Let me show you what I mean. Take this string of lanterns. The string connecting all the lanterns is a line, but an indented line cannot be carved away or raised up. So I have to make that line representing the string into a skinny shape. That way I'll be able to carve away the background, creating a raised shape that is the lantern string. All your lines must be represented as shapes in your draft. So instead of having something like this, you'll need to have something like this. Now we've got to draw our design on our pots. The first step to carving is a line drawing. We've got to take the draft and use it to trace, transfer, and draw our design right onto our pot. Drawing on a 3D surface can be a challenge, but don't forget, clay is very forgiving and easily erased as long as you draw softly with your needle tool. In this section of the video, you will see me use every lazy baby technique to get out of freehand drawing. I will cut out parts of my draft so I can trace it directly onto my pot. I use plastic lids and see-through transparencies as templates. I even use carbon paper to transfer my tiger onto my pot. Once the carbon copy is on my pot, I use my needle tool to etch in the lines. For more info on transfer paper, check out the link in the top right corner of this video. Notice that when I transfer my draft onto my pot, I make sure that every line turns into a shape so that I can carve it out later. I sometimes use my ruler for straight lines, and when I got to the gate, I really wanted my lines to be crisp, straight, and consistently thick. So I took a time out to create a homemade stencil I could trace. After cutting out the silhouette of the Chinese gate, I used a spray bottle to stick the thin paper to my pot for tracing. I traced the silhouette and then drew in the details with my needle tool, ignoring the blue lines left behind from the paper. I'll carve most of that away anyway, and what's left will burn away in the kiln. And here's the finished line drawing on my pot. As it spins, I give it a double check and make sure that all my lines have been turned into carvable shapes. It's carving time. Let's talk tools. First up, anything hard and sharp is what you're looking for. I like to use dental tools, wax carving tools, mini ribbon tools, a needle tool, and what I call a scoopy tool. It's got like a little scoop on the end, but sharp. And wooden tools are best when your clay is still on the wet side. Now, before we start, you need to understand that when we carve, we are trying to make a 3D sculpture. That means that we need to carve away every single line. Yeah, you heard me right. We just drew all those lines, I know, and now we need to get rid of them all. Let me explain. Look at your face in the mirror. Do you see a black outline around your nose like some kind of cartoon character? No! The lines that we draw around noses are just a quick representation of shape and shadow. In real life, our noses pop outward and leave a shadow around them, not a line. Lines are for 2D drawings, not 3D sculptures. What we need is shadow. We get shadow by making things 3D, by making them pop forward. Let's take a little time out so I can break down carving for you. I'm going to sculpt some scales to help us wrap our minds around carving a 2D drawing into a 3D sculpture. I first start by drawing my lines. Secondly, I observe my drawing. I try to figure out how to make the lines into 3D planes. That means I'm trying to figure out which shapes are in front and which shapes are behind. I have 3 rows of scales and a background. Right off the top, I know that my background will be behind my scales. It will be the very farthest back thing. Now I figure out the 3 rows of scales. Which row of scales is closest to us or on top? Which row of scales is farthest away from us or on the bottom? And that leaves this row of scales in the middle. Okay, now that we have an idea of what's in front of what, let's talk about shadow. Most light sources come from above. This means that things on top will cast a shadow onto things that are below. Shadow creates the illusion of depth. The shadows tell us what's on top and what's behind or on bottom. Let's try this out with clay. We are literally going to carve down one side of every line, creating an edge, like a literal edge. Get it? It's an edge, like a wall, like a canyon or a cliff. We're gonna make some cliffs here today. Where the lines used to be, there will now be a drop, and this drop will create a shadow. So, first things first, I carved back the background, being careful not to go deeper than halfway through my clay. Notice that when I carve back my background, 3 things happen. Number 1, my line is gone. Ta-da! Remember we were trying to get rid of those lines? Well, guess what? I just eliminated these lines, and they're replaced by an edge. Second, that edge casts a shadow onto the background. So we've got an edge, we have no more line, and we have shadow. 3, I also carved an undercut, making an even more dynamic angle and shadow. Carving an undercut means that instead of carving the drop straight down, making a straight up and down wall, I actually carved the wall at a more acute angle, creating an even more dynamic shadow. Sweet! Now we're going to go up a step to the bottom row of scales. I head over to the line that separates the middle row from the bottom row, and I carve it down deep at the line. In fact, I carve that line away with an undercut, creating a deep shadow. Okay, it's time to take a pause. Right now I have a deep trench, carving away the line and creating a shadow. However, I have to figure out what to do with this clay. See all this clay over here? What do I do with it? Let's take a look at a drawing of the side view of this trench situation. I could carve this plane in a flat line, creating a flat step downward. However, if I do that, I'll be carving away most of the wall that is making all this deep shadow on the background. I don't really want to do that. So instead of carving this plane away into a flat plane, I'm going to carve it away at a gradual diagonal angle. This way my sculpture looks less flat, and I get to keep this high wall making all this desired shadow on the background. It's like win-win-win. I then carve the same way into the line that separates the top and middle rows of scales. I carve away the line with a deep undercut and then carve that trench upward at a diagonal. Take a peek at the finished product. Look at all this intense shadow created with undercuts. Notice how all my lines are gone. What lines? There are no lines. This is 3D. The lines have all disappeared. We're left with real shadow. We have a real 3D carving, and we don't need the illusion of line and shadow. We have the real thing. That is the beauty of carving. Are you excited yet? I'm pretty excited. I'm going to show you a quick examples of what not to do. Compare the difference between our 3D carving full of shadows to a simple line drawing. They're incomparable. Like, lines, really? Why would you want lines when you can have literal scales? So fresh and so 3D. So fresh and so 3D. That's hilarious. Anyway, okay. Every year I get some lazy babies that realize it took me about 30 minutes to carve a 2 by 2 inch square, and they start to cut corners. They decide to just carve deeper lines. I'll grant you, there is more shadow this way, but look, all the scales still look flat. So the lazy baby will slightly up their game and carve deep trenches around their scales. Well, congratulations! Now you just have a deeper and wider outline. Your scales are still flat. Look at them. They're all flat. They're all facing straight up. Boring. And that is why it's so important to carve the scales themselves at a diagonal angle. Notice that at the side view, all the ends of my scales are the same height, and the scales are carved down at the shadowy undercut at a diagonal. This is the special magic that helps your carvings look three-dimensional and not flat. Now that I've tried to explain how I carve and make planes three-dimensional, I'm going to give you some helpful hints while you see my carving in action. When carving, the first thing I want to do is carve away the background as far as I can go. This will give me a clean view of how much depth I have to play with. Remember, don't go past halfway. You only want to carve the top half of the clay surface away. Be very careful not to go past the halfway mark. As the thinner your clay gets, the more susceptible it is to cracks and chips. When you're first starting out, it can be difficult to know how deep you should go. The best way to figure it out is to use your eyes and your sense of touch. If you're carving something flat, take a look at it from the side view to see how deep you've gone. Your hand will be able to feel how thick the clay is from the top and the bottom. You'll see me stick my hand into my pot from time to time to double check my thickness and to make sure I haven't gone too far. I threw this pot extra thick just to make sure that it could take all the carving. If you can't figure out how deep you've gone, don't worry. You'll know when you've gone too far, like when there's a hole in it. If you carve all the way through, congratulate yourself because that is the best and most memorable way to learn a good old-fashioned lesson. If this happens to you, slip and score a patch of clay onto the top and also to the bottom if you can get your hand in there. Let that clay set up for the night before carving it away the next day. If it's not possible to patch your mistakes, then just get back on the wheel and throw another pot. It's no big deal. In a true relief carving, we only subtract. We only carve away. We don't add anything. This means that the surface of my pot will become the farthest area sticking out in my design. Everything else will be carved away. Every single line I've drawn divides two separate planes. One side of that plane will be higher and the other side will be carved backward or farther away. So when I start carving an area, I do a quick visual sweep to know what will be closest to me and what will be farthest from me. Spoiler, the background's always the farthest. Take a look at this clip of me carving out this cloud. Notice how each layer of the cloud not only rises above the previous layer, but then I go back and undercut beneath the cloud, creating a more intense shadow around it. This is what I was talking about with the undercuts. Make sure to tuck your tool underneath the back side of each layer to create an intense shadow. And if you're in my class, for pity's sake, get rid of all the lines. Have I said this enough times yet? No lines. Carve them away and then turn them into shadow. Quit drawing and start sculpting. For the record, there's so much amazing clay art out there that really relies on line. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm a high school teacher teaching traditional sculpting, and this is such an important skill. Students, learn the skill and then take it or leave it. Be a lifelike sculptor or draw cute lines on mugs. I don't care. But if you're in my class, homie, better not see any lines on this project. Notice that while I'm carving, I usually have the majority of my pot bagged and sprayed. I also periodically miss the area I'm carving when I notice that the clay is carving away in chips or in a dust. This means I need to rehydrate a moment and then carry on carving. I like to rehydrate with a mist from a sprayer. Anyway, something else to bear in mind is that when your clay is still pretty soft, carving will be very messy. You'll have gunky bits in all your crevices, and those gunky bits will be wet and stick to everything. Just leave the gunk alone. It's okay and to be expected. When you're pretty much finished with all your major carving, allow your clay to harden a little bit until your gunky bits don't stick and they just kind of fall off. Take a dry, soft paintbrush and knock them away. But no matter what you do not use a sponge anywhere on this carved piece. A sponge is used to wipe things away. To wipe away is to erase. It is 100% counterproductive, so avoid using a sponge at all costs. You'd be better off using a wet paintbrush to smooth things instead of a sponge. The other terrible thing a sponge does is it leaves grit and grog behind on the top layer of the surface of the clay. Just don't do it. It doesn't look good. To carve into little tiny areas, you can make relief cuts. That means that instead of swiping large areas away, you'll draw a little crosshatch section in the area you want to carve out, and then you'll go back in and chip it away. And that brings us to cleanup time. When I'm finished finish carving all the small areas of my pot, I take a moment to assess the piece for the first time as one sculpture. Do all the carved areas work together as a whole? I also double check that all my carvings are defined by shadow. Are any of my shadows weak and hard to see? Make any last minute carving adjustments before we start to clean up. Once all your carving is complete, you are about 80% finished. I know, you thought you were done, but you still got 20% to go. The last 20% is cleanup, and it will be tedious, but the great will dig in and realize the crowning glory that is impeccable craftsmanship. Put on a good podcast and just get it done. And remember that impeccable craftsmanship is only impeccable when every surface is neat and clean. That includes the rims, the edges, the backs, the bottoms, the insides, and the walls. Get it all. I like to do a few things during cleanup. First, I compress and smooth the entire surface with a flat, hard tool. For large open areas, I can use a rubber rib if it will fit. For smaller areas, I use a flat metal tool, maybe the back of a spoon, the back of my scoopy tool, the side of a needle tool, a polished rock, or even the back of my fingernail. That's a good one. I don't rub hard or long enough that the clay gets burnished and starts to look buffed like metal. I just compress lightly so that none of the carving looks scratched away and everything is smooth. Burnishing only really looks good when you can burnish every area intentionally. With a 3D surface, it becomes very difficult to burnish really vulnerable areas. Anyway, I don't burnish. Once all the flat areas are well compressed, I use my hard rubber tip tools to reinforce clean shadows by compressing all the carved areas and undercuts. Be extra gentle doing this. Your piece should be leather hard or a little bit harder. If your clay is too dry, you can easily chip away all the details that you work so hard to carve. So be cautious and be gentle. And then here you can see my finished carved greenware pot. I put it in the kiln at cone 05. And then that's the bisqueware piece after the bisque firing. I hope you guys learned something or enjoyed how I carve my pots and sculptures. I hope that this video tutorial can replace my frantic hot mess 10-minute class demos where I basically share the greatest hits on ways to destroy your work. If one more kid asks me if I know what I'm doing during a demo, I promise you. Anyway, like and subscribe and leave a comment if you got this far and want to make a teacher's dreams come true. Happy day! Did anybody notice the not so subtly hidden Roblox avatar? That's for my little niecey pie, Coral Rose. I love you.